Ugh, look at that. Is that a nice looking building? I don't think so. I think it looks like a prison or some sort of building from the future, like in a bad science fiction movie. It was the HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. That looks like a smidgen of perhaps the FBI building. Yeah, the FBI building. And take a look at this one. What is it? I don't know. Health and Human Services, maybe? These are grim, awful buildings, and they go by an architectural style known as brutalism. Brutalism. It's brutally ugly. There's a message here, perhaps. We're joined now by Justin Shubow. He is the president of the National Civic Art Society. He also served on the Commission of Fine Arts during President Trump's first term. Sir, welcome, and noticed your name in the newspaper. And that whole thing about brutalism is kind of fascinating and kind of depressing at the same time. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Brutalism is a style of architecture that became prevalent in America and in particular Washington, D.C. in the mid-20th century. It is typified by raw concrete surfaces, relentless grids, no ornament, no adornment, and in a sense, it was a kind of anti-beauty. If you listen to the original creators of this style of architecture, they would not talk about beauty. They would talk about the need to show the honesty of the materials, and you can read between the lines and hear them talking about the harsh reality of life. There was a plague of these buildings built in Washington. You have showed a number of them. They represent the federal government as the worst kind of power one can imagine. I mean, these are not buildings that inspire the American people, that ennoble the United States, but rather they oppress us. They are dismal. And as the name suggests, they are brutal.
So if we look at a building like the Capitol building or the Supreme Court, I remember as a kid going by these buildings and wow, and I felt patriotic, you know what I mean? They really do inspire. Why did they make the decision to abandon something that was so beautiful and, spirit lifting to go to something? Is it because the government, they wanted to assert power and this was a way of conveying that? And when did it happen and who's most responsible?
Well, you mentioned the Capitol building, and now we see the Supreme Court building. The founding fathers consciously chose classical architecture for the core buildings of government in the new nation, and they inaugurated a tradition that lasted for about 150 years, such that classical architecture is the architecture of American democracy. But to tell a little bit of the backstory, after World War II, Europe needed to reconstruct, and there was this emphasis on this new kind of architecture, brutalism, to be used for social housing, to be used for socialist purposes or utopian purposes. The irony being that instead of creating a utopia, it creates a kind of dystopia. That's why these buildings are often featured in science fiction movies about a really unpleasant future. You asked who is responsible. In Europe, the original creators of brutalism were architects such as Le Corbusier and the Smithsons.
But what about in America, in D.C., Lyndon Johnson, those guys, who did it?
Well, you could really blame the bureaucrats within the federal government. The agency overseeing these buildings is the General Services Administration, and they wished to hire, the cutting-edge architects of their time to build these monstrous, ugly buildings. They did not wish to construct in a style that was historic, that represented anything in the past. They wanted to create a new world for a new kind of human beings. And, you look at the HUD building with its honeycomb-like windows, you get a sense that this is a building for insects, not for human beings.
Totally.
Or you look at the FBI building, which I call the Ministry of fear. It's the equivalent of a boot stomping on your face for all of eternity. It's a really unpleasant depiction of the government. And fortunately, President Trump recognized this, and at the end of his first term, issued a revolutionary executive order that reoriented federal architecture away from ugly modernism toward beautiful classical and traditional design, and essentially banned brutalism.
It's awesome. And he reiterated that on Inauguration Day with another executive order. So respect regional, traditional, beautiful, classical architecture, our heritage, to uplift and beautify public spaces. It's terrific stuff. Where we're going now. Justin Shubow, totally fascinating. Thank you. And let's talk again soon. We'll be right back.